So in this video, let's do a bit of a thought experiment. Today, in mainstream thinking, Vietnam is widely considered a poor decision and failure on America's part. While it's undeniable that it was, as the whole reason for it, which was to prevent the communist North from taking over the capital itself, an outcome that ended up happening even after the USA spent $168 billion, or $1 trillion in today's money, 1.4 million casualties, and irreparable damage to countless families. Meanwhile, the Korean War is not looked back with such disappointment, even though the Korean War relatively had the exact same purpose, prevent a communist North from taking over the capital itself. It is easy to justify it. North Korea is undeniably one of the most oppressed, miserable places on earth, while South Korea, under a capitalist market, has been a shining example of what a modern Asian nation can be. With thriving companies like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG, South Koreans experience a much all-around richer life than their brothers and sisters to the north. South Korea ranks third in net take-home pay, fourth in ease of doing business, top 5 in almost all educational categories, 11th in life expectancy, 12th in Human Development Index. Meanwhile, North Korea is just off the Richter scale on human rights violations and just general shittiness of a nation. So it's easy to say, hey, if we hadn't gone to Korea and fought the northern takeover, there would be 52 million people right now living in very shitty lives. And that's not a wrong conclusion, as we can only assume North Korea would be as shitty today as they would have been allowed to reunify the Korean peninsula under Kim Il-sung. But what if that assumption is wrong? Let's look at Vietnam. Vietnam today is not anywhere as dreadful as North Korea. In fact, it's a pretty desirable place to live in comparison. A pretty typical rising South Asian economy that welcomes tourism and has fairly modern cities. Before COVID, they had a thriving tourism industry. I always joke that it seems that the cliche thing to do in the backpacker world is to motorcycle Vietnam. So I guess the question is, let's say America would have been able to have prevented a northern takeover of South Vietnam, but not have unified Vietnam under a capitalist agenda. An identical outcome to what happened in Korea. Is it possible that the communist North of Vietnam would have fallen into an equally tyrannical way of life as North Korea? I see this as very likely, because tyranny thrives on conflict. When you have a constant threat of all-out war on your homeland, that creates a perfect environment for tyrannical leadership to survive. When a population lives in fear, that they tend to desire a fast-acting, decisive, strong-willed leadership. Unfortunately, people who typically show that combination is usually a tyrant. Koreans living in a constant fear of war, after all, the Korean War never actually officially ended, could justify living in a war state, where obedience is necessary for the survival of the nation, and large military spending. Living in perpetual crisis, authoritarianism was natural. Not only that, but the situation that North Korea found themselves in locked them into a dependency on China, another authoritarian nation. Vietnam, on the other hand, having eliminated the American threat on their homeland, was able to cut ties with China, went to war with the Khmer Rouge, and managed to follow their strongest ally, the USSR, through a restructuring of their economies in the late 80s. People who have visited North Korea say that the reunification of the Korean peninsula is all they ever talk about. It's not a question to them of if it's going to happen, but when. They talk like it might happen tomorrow. The constant preparedness for war and the crossing of the DMZ seems to be the tool used to not think about domestic reforms. But what if that was not the reality? What if the peninsula was unified? Maybe there would be domestic reforms accomplished and a less dystopian state in existence. Now, I doubt that a unified Korean peninsula under a northern government would today be as liberal and free as South Korea is. But I also doubt that it would be as bad as North Korea currently is. I think at worst it would resemble a China-like state, and at best it would resemble a Vietnam-like state.